I've had this question for a very long time. Everything has a beginning, and I just want to know how this all started. How did we get here? How did we come up with all this? How did it start? When did it start? Who was the first? What came next? What was it about? How has it evolved? How did it come to be as it is? Who started it? The terminology? The recurring motifs? The relationships? That had to all start somewhere? But with who? And how and when and what? That brings me to my one and only question, which is...
when did fanfiction?
I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room knows what fanfiction is, but it feels weird if I don't give a definition, so fanfiction is a type of amateur writing that involves taking another work and changing something about it, or writing within that established universe. This includes what-if scenarios, epilogues exploring what happens after the main events of a story, other characters' perspectives on certain story events, or seeing what a relationship between certain characters would look like. The last one is usually the case, the last one is actually always the case. If you read fanfiction today, you'll notice there are a lot of conventions, a culture, and a whole secret code you end up learning the more you read it. Let's see if any of the following rings a bell. Her emerald pools shone as she poured into his violet orbs. You know what I mean? I feel like outside of the realm of fanfiction, nobody would get what this is saying, but fanfiction enjoyers, we know. And it made me think, like, how did fanfiction evolve to get to this point? And what did it look like before we had these conventions? When did fanfiction start becoming a thing? Well, the answer is a bit blurry. There are different theories as to where fanfiction began. Some say that it started as early as Virgil's Aeneid, continuing where Homer left off in the Iliad, because that's technically fanfiction. Some people attribute it to Shakespeare, because what he wrote is also technically fanfiction. There are also a lot of people saying that it didn't really start until science fiction fan magazines, more specifically Star Trek. There are also some old books here and there that have been considered definitely fanfiction. And you know what? We're gonna break down these series, pick them apart, and see if they hold water, but also, we're gonna see if they don't. So, in this one shot, allow me to self-insert as I ship you this information and have it cross over into your head cannons and have the facts slowly burn into your memory. Yeah, I think that's all the fanfiction puns I can make. Are you already on the transition screen? Alright, get a load of this, right? Nothing Shakespeare wrote was original. Shakespeare's plays borrow their plots from pre-existing works. He changes things up, sure, but there's no doubt that he's basing things off of another story. Take Othello, for example. Shakespeare borrowed the plot from Un Capitano Moro, an Italian tale by Cinthio. It's pretty much the same story as Othello. The plot involves the Venetian Desdemona and her lover, a Moorish Venetian captain, both tricked by his ensign. There's a whole love triangle between the three, and the ensign is jealous of the Moor, so he waits for the right moment to accuse his wife of cheating in order to screw over their marriage. He finds it when Desdemona sympathizes with a captain the Moor doesn't like, and the ensign's all like, yo, your wife is definitely cheating on you with that guy. And the Moor's all like, well, I don't believe it, and I'm not going to unless I see it with my own eyes. Then the handkerchief thing happens where it ends up in the captain's house, and there's also the fight in the dark that fails. Anyways, people start dying, and in some way or another, everyone ends up either tortured or dead in the end. Sounds familiar, right? So what did Shakespeare change? Well, the first big thing is that he gave everyone names. In the Italian tale, Desdemona was the only one given a name. He also makes the ensign a more complex character. In the original, he was in love with Desdemona and did everything out of spite for the Moor, but in Othello, Shakespeare made Iago more ambitious. He wanted Cassio gone so he could get a higher position. Shakespeare also added some new original characters, like Rodrigo and Bianca, and made the story more politically relevant by adding in the Muslim Turks versus Christian Venetians war that was going on at the time. There's also some minor plot changes. In the original, the ensign attacks the captain in the dark by himself. But in Othello, Iago convinces Rodrigo to kill Cassio, or at least attempt to. The way Desdemona dies is different too. The Moor makes it look like a ceiling collapse accident, a lot less dramatic than the wedding bed stabbing. By fixing things like the names and making the story more complex and interesting, this could be classified as a fix-it fic, where a fanfiction writer will take a work and iron out things that they found issues with to make the story better. People are hesitant to say that this is the true beginning of fanfiction, because our understanding of fanfiction is as an amateur form of writing. Now, I don't know if you guys knew this, but Shakespeare was a pro-successful playwright. He was no amateur. So, while it does meet the other criteria for being a fanfiction, and I'm sure Shakespeare was a fan of Cinthio, it's too professional of a work of literature for some to consider it fanfiction. But hey, it's a start. Perhaps a bit closer to our idea of fanfiction is Shamala by Henry Fielding, but before I talk about Shamala, I'll have to give you a brief summary of the book it's based off of, Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. It's about this 15-year-old innocent housemaid who refuses the romantic advances of her wealthy boss, Mr. B. As a reward for her virtue, he asks her to marry him, and she accepts with open arms. Yeah, I know, it's pretty whack. And we're not the only ones who thought that. It started a whole wave of anti-Pamela literature, the most famous of which being Shamala, a total crack fic that paints Pamela as a conniving gold digger and social climber who lures Mr. B into an unhappy marriage. It starts off with these two guys talking about the actual book Pamela, but one of them says he knows the true story of Pamela, whose actual name is Shamala, and she isn't as innocent as she seems. The parody includes things like Mr. B's last name turning out to be Booby, and Shamala frequently mispronouncing virtue as Vartue. But Henry wasn't done writing stuff about Pamela. He also released Jonathan Andrews, which follows Shamala's brother, who refuses the romantic advancements of Lady Booby. This could be considered an early example of a Rule 63 or gender bend fic, in which you take the original story and switch around the genders of the characters involved. Again, it suffers from the same issue as Shakespeare's works when it comes to whether or not it can be considered fanfiction. Henry was a legit pro-author, and Shamala isn't an amateur book written by a fan. But this is just a general issue we're gonna run into when it comes to identifying early fanfictions, because legit authors were the only ones who had the resources to get their writing published and out there. Pamela was super popular, and I guarantee you that there were some homebodies out there thinking about writing their own Pamela fics, but those either never saw the light of day or got lost to time. The lack of easily accessible publishing definitely put a damper on things. There's a school of thought that considers an Icelandic translation of Dracula to be an early example of fanfic. It's called Macht Myrkrana, which translates to Powers of Darkness in English. It's half the length of the original Dracula and adds new characters, Norse mythology references, a different narration style, and it cuts dialogue in favor of more action and less bro hangout moments with Van Helsing and company. It's drastically different from the original book, and some people actually prefer this version. We only really found out how different it was from the original text in 2017, when Hans Cornel de Roos published an English translation of Macht Myrkrana, highlighting how different the two texts were. Shortly after, Swedish publisher Rickard Berghorn came out about the Swedish translation, Mor Krits Nackder, which is also drastically different from the original plot, and came out 1 year before Macht Myrkrana. It has a distinctive writing style change after the first part, and this altered translation is 2 times the length of the original text, which if you didn't know is a lot of book. For reference, this is my copy of the original. Imagine this times 2. So Dracula, in this version Draculitz, has a cult. He conspires with politicians to enforce a racial hierarchy in society, vampires being superior to humans. Like what Shakespeare did with Othello, this altered translation makes the story more politically relevant by adding in themes of fascism and addressing anti-Semitism, which was on the rise at the time. The translations also have this new blonde vampire girl, who in my opinion is a total Mary Sue. She's way overpowered and literally only shows up in the plot to seduce John. So sounds like these 2 translations are good contenders for examples of early fanfic, yeah? They change a good amount of the story, they aren't written by pro writers, and the ideas are totally their own, except that they're not. The translations share lots of similarities with earlier drafts of Dracula and things that Bram ended up not putting in the final book. This includes the blonde vampire girl, who was also in one of Bram's short stories, Dracula's Guest, which also interestingly mirrors the distinct writing style of Morkret's Makdir. Bram also wrote a foreword for Macht mir Krana, so it's highly likely that the translators were in communications with Bram. Maybe he sent them an earlier draft, maybe he just wanted to see what the story would look like if he didn't cut out certain ideas, who knows. But one thing we do know is that his involvement with the translations disqualifies it from being a true fanfiction because it'd be authorized by Bram, the original writer. Busted. So around this time, the Janeites, a term for Jane Austen enthusiasts, pop up. They're one of the very first examples of a fandom, and are still around today. 1913 saw the publication of the first ever Jane Austen fanfic, Old Friends and New Fancies, a crossover of her 6 major novels. There's a lot going on in it, but to give you an idea of what it's like, one of the driving plot points follows Mr. and Mrs. Darcy, who have 3 kids by the way, setting up Colonel Fitzwilliam and Georgiana Darcy, then having to call off their wedding shortly after because of misinterpreted feelings. Fitzwilliam later falls for Mary Crawford from Mansfield Park, but turns out that she's actually getting married to Sir Walter Elliot from Persuasion. In response, he resolves to keep his distance and decides to chill out in Ireland and take the edge off by going hunting with the lads. Turns out that Mary isn't actually getting married, and it's just a rumor started by overly excited family members, but once she's made aware of Fitzwilliam's feelings, she believes that it's too late. The miscommunication really screwed over the possibility of them getting together until, bam, Fitzwilliam gets severely injured while hunting in Ireland with the lads, which compels Mary to send him a message of her love. He recovers and they get married or whatever. And guess what? The author, Sybil Grace Brinton, isn't an established author. This was the only book she ever published, and we know almost nothing else about her. We're starting to see amateurs, fans, step up to the plate. The printing press in the early 20th century starts making it real easy to publish stuff. Here we're gonna witness the rise of fanzines, aka fan magazines. These were self-published, non-commercial, and printed in small numbers for niche audiences in certain subcultures, like Sherlock Holmes societies or the more prominent science fiction fans and fan clubs. Fanzines, or zines, varied a lot in content. Going through the Baker Street Journal, a 1940s Sherlock Holmes zine, I found a fictional story told in the point of view of Holmes's dentist, an analysis of the comparative zoology of Baker Street, poetry, an analysis on Holmes's music taste, a letter column with constructive criticism on fiction pieces in previous issues, the first ever reader insert stories, and what Sherlock Holmes's diary might look like. I saw Sherlock-specific terms like Holmesian scholarship and Sherlockian being used, but more general fanzine jargon was being developed at the time, including fan fiction itself. Fancyclopedia, which is an encyclopedia on fanzine and fandom terms published in 1947, gave us the definition. Sometimes improperly used to mean fan science fiction, that is, ordinary fantasy published in a fan magazine. There was a mini feud between fans of pro fiction writers and fans of amateur fiction writers. This definition is interesting because it basically says that fan fiction was a term only used in the sci-fi community. Some zines were more fiction and story focused, some were more research and data focused, and a lot were a good balance of both. I looked at Macabre, a 1948 sci-fi magazine, and it started with an author's note / thank you, followed by an original fiction story, then a discussion of politics on Venus, art, then a Bible story turned sci-fi, a crossword, and lastly, letters from readers. This is the era that really puts the fan in fanfiction, and it starts really being a social thing. But Star Trek is where a lot of people pin the beginning of modern fandom and fanfiction to be at. When you look at it, it's not hard to see why. The way Star Trek fanzines mirror contemporary fanfiction is uncannily similar, and a lot of modern-day fanfiction terminology originates from this era. Undoubtedly, the most influential Star Trek fanzine is Spockanalia, which is also the first fanzine to feature solely Star Trek-related content. It was published as a one-shot, a term that's still used today, but got really popular and ended up going on for 5 more volumes. Like the Baker Street Journal, it featured a wide variety of content. The biology of a Vulcan, a model of what a Vulcan heart might look like, poetry, lots of art, an analysis on Spock and Kirk's 3D chess games and what it says about their characters, a psychoanalysis of Spock, a fan-made episode script, 4-panel comics, a humorous song, a news section, advertisements for upcoming Star Trek cons, and a foreword from Leonard Nimoy himself, wishing the publication success. It also featured something called a nivar, which is defined as any work of art that depicts 2 sides of things. things. Nivaris started appearing in later Star Trek fanzines, and it actually ends up as the new name for the planet Vulcan in the actual show. There were tons and tons of different Star Trek zines that had so many different things to offer, and also super niche ones like The Voyages, a zine dedicated entirely to the character McCoy. Some were more science-focused and talked about things like the anatomy of the Enterprise ship, and some were more fanfiction-focused. These zines were also a huge means of communication and collaboration. Fans would give feedback and start discussions in fan letters featured in zines. There was even a zine called the Hulkan Council that consisted entirely of letters and acted as a forum. This is very similar to the culture surrounding fanfiction today, which is very collaborative and interactive. The only difference now is that we don't have to pay for stamps in order to post a comment, we just need to hit post. There was also a lot of activism seen in these zines. Paramount was nearing the end of making new Star Trek episodes, and there were a lot of zines encouraging readers to write to Paramount to implore them to film more Star Trek content. Some even provided instructions on how to do so. Well, it worked because Paramount ended up swamped with letters from Star Trek fans and ended up making a whole new show and stuff. They even had to hire a secretary just to answer Star Trek related letters. One of the reasons why there were so many zines is because there was a pattern of a new zine popping up, it gets really popular, then it gets too popular for the tiny team behind it to meet up with the demand, it gets retired, and a new zine pops up to fill its void. Publication definitely got in the way of releasing zines because it took a lot of resources to publish zines. They needed to be mimeographed hundreds of times, a whole team needed to be involved, and they needed to pay for shipping costs. It wasn't uncommon for teams behind zines to actually lose money instead of profit, even when they had a lot of subscribers. Fanfiction today is a lot easier to create and put out there. Any smooth brain with internet access can do it. Some of the terms we still use today that have their origins in the Star Trek fanzine boom include hurt/comfort/ ampersand. Oh, and Mary Sue. Star Trek fanzines birthed the Mary Sue trope. You see, there was a common story outline that certain Star Trek fan fiction followed in which a new, young, usually female crew member joins the Enterprise, the whole ship ends up adoring her, she has extraordinary super abilities and or great feats accomplished, and ends up romancing one of the main characters. Fanfiction writer Paula Smith took notice of this trend and decided to parody it. The following is what she came up with.
Gee, golly, gosh, Gorski, thought Mary Sue as she stepped on the bridge of the Enterprise. Here I am, the youngest lieutenant in the fleet, only 15 and a half years old. Captain Kirk himself came up to her. Oh, Lieutenant, I love you madly. Will you come to bed with me? Captain, I am not that kind of girl. You're right, and I respect you for it. Here, take over the ship for a minute while I go get some coffee for us. Mr. Spock came out of the bridge. What are you doing in the command seat, Lieutenant? The captain told me to. Flawlessly logical. I admire your mind. Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Mr. Scott beamed down with Lieutenant Mary Sue to, I can't read Roman numerals, to Regal XXXVII. They were attacked by green androids and thrown into prison. In a moment of weakness, Lieutenant Mary Sue revealed to Mr. Spock that she too was half Vulcan. Recovering quickly, she sprung the lock with her hairpin. They all got away back to the ship. But back on board, Dr. McCoy and Lieutenant Mary Sue found out that the men who had beamed down were seriously stricken by the jumping cold Robbies. Mary Sue less so. While the four officers languished in the sickbay, Lieutenant Mary Sue ran the ship and ran so well that she received the Nobel Peace Prize, the Vulcan Order of Gallantry, and the Tralfamadorian Order of Good Guyhood. However, the disease finally got to her, and she fell fatally ill. In the sickbay, as she breathed her last, she was surrounded by Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Mr. Scott, all weeping unashamedly at the loss of her beautiful youth and youthful beauty, intelligence, capability, and all-around niceness. Even to this day, her birthday is a national holiday of the Enterprise.
So yeah, that's where the term Mary Sue comes from. So we watched it go from some old white dudes reimagining old stories to young women writing about what their favorite alien-human gay couple would look like. I noticed that in the beginning, our early fan fiction contenders made their original works more politically relevant, which is a trend that seemed to fade away over time. I also noticed that as it became easier for the general public to access publication, more female writers stepped up to the plate. Women dominated the fanzine scene, and 80% of writers today on fanfiction site Archive of Our Own identify as women or femme-leaning, 16% identify outside of the binary, and 4%, only 4%, identify as male or masculine leaning. The online era has also birthed a lot of fanfiction terminology. Shipping comes from fans of the show The X-Files. Those who thought that Fox Mulder and Dana Scully should be in a relationship banded together and called themselves the Relationshippers, but that's like 5 syllables too long, so it got shortened to our shippers. But that's like 3 syllables too long, so it got shortened to shippers, and now we physically cannot shorten it anymore. Good job, team. Fanfiction is also where a lot of writers get their start. Writer Naomi Novik said, "Turns out half the publishing industry has read or written fanfiction. It's also working its way up to the mainstream. Did you know that 50 Shades of Grey originated as a Twilight fanfiction? And not only that, but when comparing the two texts, they have an 89% similarity rate. Pretty much every author knows what fanfiction is, but there's quite a bit of difference in opinions. Some embrace all fanfiction, some have a zero tolerance policy, and a lot are okay with it under certain circumstances. There's also some authors who are concerned about the copyright issues that come with fanfiction, and fans have adapted to that by adding little copyright disclaimers before their fics. They'll usually say something like, all characters belong to such and such author. Well, there you have it. There's a lot of ways to answer the question of when fanfiction started. I feel like it's in human nature to continue stories we really liked and have it happen in our own way, or speculate what happens after, so really, in my opinion, fanfiction is timeless.